Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I'm so delighted you've joined me for part 4 of our story tonight because it's very, very exciting. We've just learnt about how the young boys listened to the grandfather telling a fabulous story about 2 incredible Bigfoot encounters. And now the young men are going to be sleeping in the yard in a tent. And it seems like something is going on. We're about to find out. So let's continue with part 4 of our story.
"What's the matter?" James asked me. "Why did you wake me up?" "I need to relieve myself. I'm desperate to go. I don't want to go out there on my own," I explained. "It's scary in the dark. Please, James, please will you come with me?" James, with a measure of reluctance, agreed to oblige my annoying, inconvenient request. I dare say he was a little piqued to have been woken up. "All right," he whispered. "I'll come with you. Now that you've woken me up, I think I also need to go. Do you know what time it is?" I shook my head. James rummaged around the surface of his sleeping bag and extracted his cell phone to check the time. "It's 3:30 in the morning," he whispered, letting out a surprised, muted whistle. "I can't believe how quiet it is out there. Listen." This was something I hadn't noticed until James pointed it out to me. He wasn't wrong. I could no longer hear the ponderous shuffle of feet that I'd heard moments before, walking around our tent. So I suspected my grandfather had likely returned to the house after looking in on us as he had promised my grandmother he would. Believe me, it was eerily silent, as we crept rather gingerly outside of our tent. It would seem the tuneful chorus of frogs and crickets was alarmingly mute, which was not a good sign, as I knew that no nocturnal orchestra could sometimes mean a predator was lurking around. I felt significantly spooked. Maybe my grandfather's accounts of having seen a face at the window when he was a boy had been feeding my imagination with outlandish ideas, without my being consciously aware of it. Maybe we should have slept indoors after all. James and I needed to find a suitable place to take a leak, but we noticed at once that something was significantly off. Everything was inauspiciously dark outside. The one starry night was covered in a murky, somewhat insidious cloud cover, which was not there earlier on in the evening when we'd been listening to my grandfather's stories around a crackling fire. So it did seem rather ominous. By this point, me and James were now desperate to go to the toilet. We used the less than sufficient light of our cell phones to guide us towards a patch of trees that were swinging their branches in a rather brisky breeze. When we relieved ourselves, that was when we heard a distinctive grunting sound. "What the hell is that?" asked James, looking at me through wide, anxious eyes. "What is it?" We both stood there anchored to the spot, with a cautious uncertainty, as we clandestinely took cover behind the trees, remaining as still as 2 ice statues at a banquet. That was when we saw the distinctive, prominent silhouette of a Bigfoot stalking our camping spot. He appeared to be examining the tent that we had hitched, testing the canvas with the back of his hands, and even looking inside the opening of the tent that we had left momentarily unzipped, while my friend remained obliviously fast asleep in his sleeping bag. He grunted again to himself, then glided away into the trees until he was gone. It was ironic after my grandfather's previous stories that very night that we'd seen a Bigfoot for ourselves. I was confounded by the startling coincidence. It was almost like the universe was having a laugh at our expense and subduing any sense of doubt on our parts. It was almost like the Bigfoot's presence was teasing everything we knew about the world and saying, "Put that in your pipe and smoke it, boys. Yes, I'm real." "Oh my word, we saw a Bigfoot," said James excitedly. "We saw a Bigfoot! I can't believe it!" But it had happened so fast that the both of us in the years that would follow would find ourselves wondering if we'd seen it at all. But I assure you we did. 12 years later, my own personal story began 3 years ago, when I was all but 20 years old. I was living with my grandmother in her red-bricked house in McDowell County.
The very house where I'd camped out with James in the backyard and seen a Bigfoot snooping around our tent, finally disappearing into the trees. By this time in my life, sadly, my grandfather had long since died, which was a given since he was significantly older than my grandmother. The memories of his stories was indelibly imprinted in my memory, that I hoped one day I would share with my own children and my grandchildren. McDowell County, where my grandmother lived, is one of the small towns, and I dare say one of the poorest counties here in West Virginia, where the average yearly income for a family is about $20,600. At one point in time, McDowell County and the towns in these parts were booming, the economy thriving, as the coal industry was doing an astonishingly productive trade, and people from far and wide came here to get wealthy on the back of coal. As a consequence, life was prosperously good for most people. Back in the day, my grandfather told me that due to the blossoming coal industry, the rivers in these parts became black from the coal. My grandfather had close friends who worked in the mines for over 60 long hours underground at a time. They never complained, even though it was gruelingly hard work. But the sense of camaraderie among the miners was absolutely incredible, and life was good, until of course the politicians decided what was best for people's lives, failing to care or remotely appreciate how closing coal mines could dramatically influence the lives, livelihoods, and emotional well-being of the people. Back in my grandfather's day, thanks to a thriving mining industry, other industries began to benefit from its gainful productivity. So it would seem coffee shops, restaurants, clothing stores, and everything else besides materialized as if by magic overnight. Building construction trade was also booming, as houses embodying stunning classic architecture were being erected, fast popping through the ground like yellow daffodils in spring. Nowadays, when you drive through McDowell County, you'll be struck with a grave sadness and a wistful nostalgia for what has been sorely lost. You observe firsthand the astonishing opulence from the past that has so tragically petered into nothing, as you can feel the vacuousness of the place, as luxurious historic homes have been swallowed by burgeoning vines and natural erosion that has worn away the resplendence of so many prominent buildings. Many have become abandoned as people left a depleted gravy train in order to chase the money trails and pursue other career paths in states that offered them the promises of a better life, as staying in a depleted economy would not be a blessing to anyone. I do, of course, know, as I mentioned in the very beginning, that when the Walmart closed down, that really did send everything spiralling into a greater decline, and people living in these desolate parts often found their escapism in drugs and alcohol. Hence my mother's tragic story, and stories like hers were born, which is a path taken by so many that led to such devastating consequences. I, of course, was determined not to go down the same slippery path. If my mother had been predisposed to an addiction that cruelly stole her life away, I was aware that the similar DNA in my blood, that if I became addicted to a drug, it would likely be the beginning of the end for me. I was lucky that my grandparents were such positive, influential role models in my young life, that I had never ever been remotely tempted to take a drug, and not once in my life had I even smoked a joint. My grandmother was eyewitness to how the changing times had hit Appalachia hard, like a hand grenade being thrown into a community. I believe that if the coal mining industry was still thriving today, things would have not become so desperately unhinged. I had learnt from my mother's short life that taking drugs was no way to live. To all intensive purposes, drug addiction has seized Appalachia with its foreboding hands. So respectable people living in these parts are more than likely clandestinely nursing some kind of addiction. It had swept over this part of the world like a festering mould that no amount of bleach could dissipate or clear away. Many of the people living here are on food stamps and state benefits, and some of the hollows around these parts are completely overcome with drug addiction. Hollows are narrow sheltered valleys between the hillsides, of which there are many, where people tend to live together in clusters of houses or trailers. Let's just say some of the roads through these hollows are rather precarious at the best of times, if you attempt driving through these hilly valleys. They are as different as Spain is from Italy, and Italy is from England, and the reception you get in different hollers can be as dramatic as night is from day. You will likely find in some of the hollers you will be met with a warm reception, while others can be distinctly unfriendly towards you and even hostile. It's almost like here in Appalachia, we have worlds within worlds, as the hollows boast different communities, all uniquely individualistic in their own right. You may ask why I had not left McDowell County at this point of my life, when I was sorely tempted to do just that, and follow my friends to pursue a college degree further afield. The answer was simple. My grandmother was fiercely independent, and for a woman of her advancing years, she really was robustly healthy and pretty strong on her feet. She didn't want to go into a retirement home, and she chose to continue living here in her red-bricked house on the edge of town, overlooking stunning groves of trees. My two best friends had long since left McDowell County and were both at different colleges out of state, but we remained constantly in touch. I only had a handful of friends around here who were not using drugs, who I hung around with in my spare time, as I was poignantly aware that you become like the company you keep. I knew the sacrifices my grandmother made for me when she adopted me as her son, so even though I was tempted to get the hell out of this downcast place swaddled by a lugubrious melancholia, I couldn't leave my grandmother on her own for too long. I felt responsible for her well-being, as she had felt towards mine. From the young age of 16, I became completely passionate about photography and invested in professional high-quality camera equipment. Soon I was making money as an amateur photographer and was often paid to do the photographs for weddings and other festive occasions. So during the weekends I'd often be travelling long distances from home, and it was during those trips I always made absolutely certain that one of the locals would look in on my grandmother regularly, as I always remembered what happened to old Mrs. Montgomery when I was a boy, having been found lying near the chicken coop unconscious, and I'd never forgive myself if my grandmother had a similar accident. I remember being home one weekend with my grandmother. It was bucketing down with rain. I was not remotely tempted to go outside in this kind of weather. My grandmother was bustling around the kitchen, making blueberry pancakes for breakfast. I glanced outside the window and was struck with how green and idyllically lush everything had become from the recent rains. "What are your plans for the day?" my grandmother had asked me. I was about to tell her it was going to be one of those quiet, uneventful weekends spent indoors, which meant my grandmother would likely persuade me to play bridge with her. She was a keen player. All of a sudden my cell phone began to ring, and on the caller ID I realised it was my good friend James McFellen, and my heart skipped a beat, as it was so good to hear from him. "I know it's last minute, bro. I'm sorry to catch you so late in the day, but one of my good friends at college has an older sister. She's getting married today. The wedding photographer she hired at vast expense has only just phoned her up 10 minutes ago to say he can't possibly do the function for her. As you can imagine, she's in a dreadful panic about things. She needs a photographer urgently. I thought of you, bro. I told her what an excellent photographer you are. I'm wondering if you don't mind travelling out here to do the photography for her wedding today. She'll pay you handsomely, cover the costs for gas and accommodation. You'll be sharing a room at the venue with a DJ, if that's all right. It's a 2-hour journey from where you are both ways. It's not too bad. Please, bro, can you do it? It will mean a lot to me." I immediately agreed to do the function, as it would be the quintessential opportunity to catch up with my old friend again. I hadn't seen James McFellen in an age. When I arrived at the venue, the bride quite literally threw her arms around me unabashedly, as if I was some kind of saviour. "Oh, thank God you came! My photographer let me down at the last minute. He says he's got a tummy bug. Can you believe that? He couldn't do the function. I knew something like this would happen on my wedding of all things. James tells me you're an outstanding photographer, so I took the liberty to look up some of your work on your website. I have to say I'm incredibly impressed. I think you're better than the professional I've actually hired, and I don't say that lightly." "I try my best," I said modestly. "I enjoy taking photographs. I hope you will be sufficiently pleased with my work. I've done dozens of weddings before, so I know the score."
"I can see that, and it's great to hear," said the bride. "If it's anything like the stuff online that I've seen, I'll be dancing on the tabletops with joy." I warmed to the bride at once. She was a very likeable woman and a pleasure to photograph, and by all accounts the wedding was a dazzling success, and it was so good to catch up with my old friend James McFellin again, who looked rather dapper, I have to say, in the suit he was wearing at the wedding. He clapped me on the back warmly.
"Good to see you, bro. Long time no see. I can't believe you're still living in McDowell County. That's crazy that you're still there. Surely you're tempted to move away when nothing goes on there." "Well, you know how it is. My grandmother is still there. She refuses to move. So I need to take care of her. If I leave McDowell County, she'll be all on her own. She took me in all those years ago when I was born, so I feel a debt of responsibility towards her. You're a better man than me, bro. I couldn't stay in McDowell County if you paid me. There's nothing going on there at all these days. While I commend your loyalty to your grandmother, I'm sure she wouldn't begrudge you moving away. Most of the young folk have left, if they know what's good for them, that is. The place is so depressing these days. If the coal industry was revived again, can you imagine what the place would be like?" "It would be brilliant," I agreed. "To be fair, my grandmother has been telling me to leave from the get-go. But while she needs me, I'm going to be there for her. I'm doing courses online, so it's not a problem for me." "You're still living in the red-bricked house?" asked James. "I suppose that's a stupid question to ask. Where else would you be living? And it's such a lovely house, too." "The very same," I said. James was reflective for a moment, and then he said, "I have so many fond memories of sitting around that fire pit with your grandfather, and him telling us those incredible stories of his. Your grandfather Howard could tell stories like no one else I know. We'd sit around the crackling fire listening to him, and you couldn't hear a pin drop. It was after that night when we camped in your front yard that I began to believe in the power of synchronicity. I mean, what were the chances of your grandfather talking about a Bigfoot that night? And then we camp in your yard, and we see one. The mind boggles. Remember, you woke me up in the middle of the night to answer a call of nature. And when we went off to take a leak, we were about to return to our tent, and were alerted to some grunting sounds. That was when we saw the Bigfoot, wandering around our camping site, snooping around our tent, investigating everything. Then he just glided away. After that event, I kept telling myself it couldn't have happened, but I know it did." "I remember it well," I said. "You're right, it was bizarre." "Did you see the Bigfoot again?" asked James. "No, I'm afraid not. But it's not for want of trying, of course. Don't you remember for years afterwards we would be knocking on trees, making those howling sounds in the woodgrove to get the thing's attention? But sadly to no avail. We tried everything, didn't we, to find that Bigfoot again? But he was not biting the bait, was he? But I bet your bottom dollar he was probably laughing at us, hiding in plain sight, watching us, fully aware that we were looking for him. That's my guess anyway. Don't you remember my grandfather would tell us not to look for the Bigfoot? He told us if the Bigfoot wanted to connect with us, we'd see him. But if he shows himself to us, it'll be on his own terms, and not ours. Don't forget my grandfather had brothers and sisters, and only he and his brother Martin ever got to see a Bigfoot on 2 separate occasions. So the sightings were rather rare. Yes, I remember us doing everything in our power to get the Bigfoot's attention," James agreed. "It became kind of a fixation, didn't it, for the both of us? Well, for the 3 of us, actually. We became pretty obsessed. There was one time, of course, we did hear whistling in the grove. Don't you remember? We couldn't explain that. No one else was around at the time. Oh, yes. I'd forgotten about that. I bet it was a Bigfoot. There is no explanation for that whistling, bro. I'm sure it was a Bigfoot. Maybe the one we saw the night wandering around our campsite. It could have been him.
Well, I'd like to think it anyway. It was incredible how your grandfather was talking about his Bigfoot encounters as a boy, and lo and behold we see one that very night. The chances of that happening are 1 in a million, I suspect. Of course, when I tell people about my strange encounter, I'm met with such skepticism. People can't believe these things actually exist. But seeing one completely dispels your doubts. It was more than a little incredulous, I agreed. You're telling me, said James. The wedding had gone marvellously well, and by the end of the evening I was in very good form, as I'd been in my element taking all those fabulous photographs of the bride, and of course catching up with James again. I'd enjoyed a couple of nightcaps with him in the bar at the end of the evening, before I finally retired to bed. I found my way down the corridors to room number 52, and turned the key in the lock. This was one room I was expected to share with the DJ, a man called Simon Trunter, as there was not enough rooms at the venue for the bride and groom to book us into our own individual rooms, which was most unfortunate. I gathered the initial photographer that they had hired lived locally and would have gone straight back home after the function. So with me being hired so late in the day, I was inevitably expected to share my sleeping quarters with the DJ, whom I was unfortunately to discover had not been informed of this fortuitous change in arrangements, so my unwelcome arrival in his room was not received with much pleasure. Simon Trunter stared at me through wide eyes as I wheeled my suitcase into the room, and gave him a somewhat sheepish smile and said, "Hello there, how you doing?" like you do when you meet a stranger for the first time. "Who are you?" he asked me. "What you doing in my room?" My skin went as red as a field of poppies, as I felt as if I'd intruded in this man's private space. But I was too fatigued to actually care. All I wanted to do was to throw myself down on the bed and crash. I was absolutely exhausted. "Oh, I'm sorry. I was hired at the last minute. The photographer for the bridal couple let them down. So I was hired in his place because he was sick. They couldn't find an extra room for me at the venue, as everything is booked up. So I was told I'd have to share with you. I was under the impression you knew about the new arrangements. I hope that's not too much of an inconvenience for you. I won't be a bother, I promise. I fully tend to crash out on the bed, and I'll likely leave very early in the morning, before breakfast, to drive back to McDowell County." The DJ pulled a face. "I did tell the bride that under no circumstances should I share a room with anyone else. I made that very clear to her. Why don't people bloody listen?" "Oh, I'm sorry," I said, not knowing what else to say. I crinkled my brow in surprise and squinted at Simon through concerned eyes. Was it really such a bother to share a room with a stranger for just one night? I privately wondered. "I promise you I won't be a bother. As I told you, I'm literally going to hit the pillow and crash. You won't hear a dicky bird from me, I can assure you." "You're not the problem, bro," said Simon, pointing at his chest. "I am. Of course I don't mind sharing a room with you, that's not the point. But you are going to mind sharing with me. I have a major snoring problem, I'm afraid. I can keep the living dead wide awake, and I'm not even remotely exaggerating." At that I laughed, waving my hand in the air dismissively and saying, "Don't you worry about me. I can handle a little snoring. It's not a train smash. I've slept through worst, I assure you." Simon frowned. "You don't know what you're talking about. There's snoring, and then there's my snoring. And there's a huge difference, believe me. You may think I'm joking, but I'm absolutely not. Just so you know, I've been married twice. 2 of my wives left me on account of my snoring. It really is that bad. You have no idea." "Your wives both left you because you snored?" I said. "That's ridiculous." "You haven't heard me snoring," said Simon. "You'll understand when you do. When I went to a sleep clinic for observations, they'd heard nothing like it. I can assure you that you won't get a wink of sleep tonight with my snores." "Don't worry about it," I said. "I'm so tired I probably won't even hear a thing." Simon was climbing into bed. He looked at me apologetically,
You're welcome to share a room with me. Be it on your own head. You can't say I didn't warn you." I had cleaned my teeth and got into my pyjamas, and sank gratefully into the folds of the crisp Egyptian cotton sheets. I knew Simon was not best pleased about my presence in the room at the wedding venue, but it was just too bad. I was far too tired to care, and once my head hit the pillow, I was out like a light, but not for long. I was awoken to the most frightful snoring noises, as if I was sleeping amongst a colony of pigs. It really was that bad, and to date I have never heard snoring like this. No wonder the sleep clinic was confounded by the noises Simon made. It was impossible to believe that a human being could make such loud noises. This was insane. I just could not get a wink of sleep, and yet I was absolutely exhausted. I knew exactly why Simon's 2 wives had ended their marriage with him. Due to his snoring. It made sense to me now. I wondered why he hadn't sought out professional help to manage his condition. Surely there were things you could do to control bad snoring like this. I imagined being married to him would guarantee you sleep deprivation and a very grumpy demeanour. I almost wanted to clobber the poor man over the head to shut him up. The noise was maddening. There was no way I could sleep in this room with him. I decided that maybe I could go downstairs and sleep in my truck, even though it would likely be incredibly uncomfortable. But anything was better than remaining in this room with Simon Trunder. I hurriedly got dressed, throwing off my pyjamas, and sauntering in the bathroom to gather my washbag together. All of a sudden I noticed that in Simon's washbag, that was sitting on the countertop wide open, there were bottles of pills bursting out of an open zip. I'm not a nosy person by nature, but for reasons I cannot explain, I found myself looking at the pill bottles. One of them was labelled caffeine. I read the back of the bottle, which read, 2 pills will keep you wide awake and alert. I imagine working late nights as a DJ, playing music for parties late into the evening. Taking caffeine or knocking back Red Bulls would possibly be an excellent way of ensuring you didn't fall asleep on the job. I stared at the bottle of caffeine pills rather longingly, through bleary eyes, and in that moment an idea burst forth in my mind. I knew it wasn't my place, of course, to help myself to something that wasn't mine, but what Simon Trunder didn't know would not hurt him. Besides, he wouldn't thank me for daring to wake him up, to ask him if he minded my helping myself to a couple of his caffeine tablets. Suffice to say, he was the reason I had to take them anyway. I couldn't sleep with that racket he was making. I gingerly knocked back a couple of caffeine pills with a glass of water. If they kept me awake, it would help me to drive home easily, with no risk of falling asleep on the journey. I would return safely home in the next couple of hours. I privately congratulated myself for this fabulous idea, and hurriedly gathered my suitcase together, trudging along to the car, where I threw my suitcase into the trunk. I suddenly felt quite energized and very much wide awake. The pills had worked almost instantaneously, so that I was popped right out of my sleepy fog-like haze, like the bread from a toaster, and found that my concentration and focus were undisputably excellent. I did not enjoy driving at night at the very best of times, but the venue was in a well-lit neighbourhood where there were street lights on everywhere. So there I was, with the music blasting away from the car stereo, finding myself driving away from the venue at the dead of night. I was in a relatively good upbeat mood by now, singing along happily to the music. Moments before I'd been mad as hell, with Simon Trunder's snoring robbing me of a potentially good night's sleep. I was amazed at the efficiency of the caffeine tablets, and made a mental note that next time I needed to drive late into the night, taking caffeine tablets was not half such a bad idea. I found myself listening to a pre-recorded program on the radio about foot funguses, which seemed a strange thing to be listening to at this late hour, and I wondered whether anyone out there was also tuning into this program, which was oddly fascinating. Several people had phoned into the program complaining that their foot funguses were terribly bad, that they had been through 7 pairs of sneakers in 1 year, and one man claimed to have not kept a girlfriend because of his cheesy feet, which for some reason I found rather inappropriately hilariously funny, while the expert was trying to give the poor man some seasoned advice. Everything was so quiet and dark as I drove home, only encountering a couple of trucks on the highway. Finally, as I reached Appalachia, I began driving down some sequestered country roads, fringed by tall, lofty trees on every side. It was intimidating driving down these roads, as the moonlight was very faint, and the only light that broke through the cloying darkness were the intrusive beams of my headlights. I began to feel incredibly funny, as the pleasing clarity and sharp wakefulness I'd experienced before had now been confiscated by an unexplained dizziness. I was sweating profusely, my hands clinging tightly to the steering wheel, so that the whites of my knuckles glared obtrusively through the skin. I tried desperately to anchor myself to the car seat. I felt if I didn't do this, I might just float away. What the hell was going on with me? Why was my head spinning like this in Catherine wheels? I didn't feel remotely good. Something was off. I felt completely spaced out. It was a discombobulating feeling that made me suddenly feel terribly afraid. I decided I needed to pull over to the side of the road to get in some much-needed fresh air. Maybe if I got in some oxygen into my system and did a few jumping jacks outside the car, the foggy feeling that was choking my senses would finally abate. I was so nearly home. I staggered awkwardly out of the car, like an ungainly inebriated drunk, and began to gratefully drink in huge gasps of fresh air. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady. It was hilly, and rocky mounds jutted through the precariously fertile rich earthen soil, while the trees swished and swayed as a light breeze blew against my skin, and its coolness gave me a marginal sense of relief. At this point my heart thundered in my chest. My breathing became intensely laboured, while sweat continued to break out all over my skin and was trickling down my back and my face. I knew something was profoundly wrong. In that horrifying second, it dawned on me, with a lightning clarity, that those so-called caffeine tablets I assumed I had taken may not have been caffeine tablets after all, but something infinitely more insidious. How could I have been so stupid? To help myself to somebody else's tablets? What was I thinking? The bottle of caffeine tablets might contain pills that were much more harmful than what I assumed I had taken. Here I was, the person whom had always been so judiciously careful not to take drugs of any kind, having done something outlandishly crazy myself. I was always sagaciously warning people, young people my age, about the intrinsic dangers of taking drugs of any kind, and to always be on their guard in not being duped into taking them. In a trice I began to see stars. I felt like I wanted to be violently sick, as a bitter nausea rose up in the back of my throat, like nothing I've experienced before or since. Whatever was in those pills made me feel as if I was living on borrowed time, and the feeling of being grounded was completely gone. I felt almost as if I was floating outside my body, like a hot air balloon on the wind. It was as if I'd lost control over my physical capabilities. I knew I needed to get back into my car as quickly as I possibly could, to get to my cell phone, so I could call the emergency services for help before I collapsed. My body became incredibly weak, and even walking a few centimetres seemed insufferably laborious. I tried desperately to get back into my car, but my unsteady balance had gone badly awry, and my coordination had gone adrift. The ground beneath my feet gave way, and I think I must have passed out. I do not know how long I blacked out for, but I believe it might have been for quite some time. I was obviously lying on the ground in a semi-conscious state, fully unaware of what was going on outside of myself. The only way I can describe the feeling to you, as if you're coming around slowly and surely from an anaesthetic, and hear background noises around you, and you feel disorientated and confused as you drift in and out of consciousness. It's almost as if you're trying to pull back a misty curtain to find out what's going on. Of course, at this point, I think I must be dreaming. I hear two people engaging in conversation together. I'm surprised to hear them talking in a foreign language that I don't know. They're chatting fast and furiously. Their voices sound concerned. I can hear the deep baritone tone of a man's voice and the feminine lightness of a female voice. What language are they speaking, I'm wondering? It's not French, German, Chinese, or even some remote African language. The next thing I know is that something is leaning over my body to examine me. A finger is tapping my cheeks and my forehead. I make a few grunting noises in response. I try desperately to open my eyes, but I just can't. A finger is nudging my mouth wide open, and some bitter stuff as bitter as gall is poured down my throat. It makes me want to gag, but I'm still out for the count. I hear the talking persist. It's a while before I find myself breaking through the murky fog, like a blind man switching on the light bulb in the hope that he actually might see. I feel something is gently touching me with their hand, as if trying to console me. And then I hear a female voice in my head saying, "It's going to be all right. Wait for the Sanaka to work." I imagine the Sanaka was the bitter concoction that had been thrust down my throat, whatever that was. I have no idea how long I lay down on the ground for. I wake up in a complete dwell, still consumed by dizziness. My senses are moderately sharper. My heart is no longer booming thunderously in my chest. I realize I've been covered with some leafy branches. I'm lying on the hilly embankment on the side of the road, heavily fringed by overhanging trees. My car is parked not too far away from me, on the grey asphalt. I open my eyes slowly to take in my surroundings. I try to make sense of my environment as I brush away the leafy branches from my body that were keeping the cool breeze off my skin. I feel momentarily confused, like my grandfather must have felt when he found himself with his brother Martin in the quarry. What the hell was I doing here? It was a while for me to remember the pills I'd taken. That was when I remembered the need to pull over my car to enjoy some fresh air. But then I'd felt so woozy that I knew I needed to get back into the car to get to my cell phone to call for help. But I'd failed to get to the car in time. But what am I doing here, on the side of the road, on the embankment, covered with leafy branches? Who put them on me? All of a sudden I sense that something is watching me. They're sitting feet away from me on their haunches. It's a female Bigfoot. My head swivels around to take her all in. The first thought that goes through my head is she real? Am I deluding myself? Am I hallucinating? The next thing that happens is the Bigfoot speaks to me in the language that I'd heard in my semi-conscious state, a language I had never heard before, nor was I remotely acquainted with. But as she speaks to me, her treacle-coloured eyes hold mine. I understand the meaning of her words, as the English seems to pop into my head like the corn in hot oil when it transforms into popcorn. "Of course I'm real. How are you feeling? You gave me quite the scare. Your spirit was flung out of your body. It was not your time to go. We had to get you grounded. You might feel disorientated for a while, but I'm sure you're going to get better." "What happened?" I asked her. "You collapsed," she said. "We saw you were dizzy. You passed out. You're going to feel a little odd, but the stuff we gave you will make the poison in your system pass through you. You'll be fine." Once again I must have blacked out, because I remember nothing after that. But a whole day had gone past, and a night was born, because the next time I woke up, I was in a cool place under the trees, swaddled by more leaves, with the female Bigfoot squatting at my side, still watching over me. I don't think for a moment she had left me. "How are you feeling?" she asked me again. "Sick," I told her. "Really sick." I do remember staggering to my feet and walking over to a bush to violently throw up the contents of my stomach that were green and revolting and smelt rank. Everything was a bit of a blur after that, I hasten to say. But after I had been sick, I recovered quickly and felt so much better. The Bigfoot led me back to my car, and I managed to get home. I spent an entire week recovering from those pills that I'd taken. I still have no idea what was in them, but they were not caffeine pills, that was for sure. When I told my grandmother what had happened, she was completely staggered and bemused. You mean to tell me you helped yourself to a stranger's tablets? You thought they contained caffeine? What the hell were you thinking? I thought you were more sensible than that. You'll probably find drug users often use old pill bottles to contain their drugs. I was sure they were caffeine, Gran, I told her bashfully. You have no idea how bad this chap's snores were. He's lost 2 marriages over his snoring. I could not sleep in that environment. But why didn't you contact James? Ask him if you could share a room with him. I'm sure he was staying at the venue. I groaned. I didn't think of that, Gran. That's the problem with the youth of today, said my grandmother, shaking her head sadly. They don't think. You know there is a major drug problem here in Appalachia, and yet despite everything you've learnt over the years about drugs, you pop 2 pills you don't know anything about, as if you're sucking candy. I despair with you. I really do. But I thought they were caffeine. Don't assume to know anything, love. There are rules you always need to follow. One of them is to never ever leave drink of yours abandoned, in case someone slips something into it when you're not looking. Number 2 is to never take a joint from a drug dealer, because it might be laced with something. And number 3 is don't accept a paracetamol from someone for a headache, unless you know they can be trusted. These drug dealers use every trick in the book, you know. You know what, Gran? I don't know what I would have done if those Bigfoots hadn't helped me. They gave me something that helped eliminate the toxic poison from my system. You're lucky they saw you. That's all I can say, said my grandmother. Since that harrowing experience, I'm all the more determined to stay the hell away from drugs of any kind. And I'm in no doubt that those Bigfoots saved my life. And for that, I'm extremely grateful. So there you are. That's my story. What an incredible story. Isn't it incredible to think that through 3 generations of that family, they all had some kind of a Bigfoot encounter. And in all of those encounters, they were helped in some way. So wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.